Hello everybody and welcome back. I'm Christo, and today in our MEIOU and Taxes 3.0 tutorial I'm going to teach you how the army works. Now the army is obviously a core part of EU4, a war game in many ways. It's other things, but it's certainly a war game. And I'm going to use a couple of examples, one of Vijayanagar and one of Great Wu here, to teach you about how you actually raise your army, what controls the size of it, what controls the expense associated with your army, and how you can get a bigger one, basically. So, firstly, your army is raised through taxes, basically. So if you go into the delegator, which hopefully you know what that is, you've watched my 10 tips to get started with MEIOU and Taxes video at least, you can delegate the tax code, and you're going to assign a certain amount of military power. Now, when you're assigning admin and dip in terms of getting money, that's all you need to worry about. There's just the admin and the dip, and then the delegator goes away and gets you the stuff, right? And there are reforms you can do that make it easier and so on, and I'll do a video on that very soon. But with military, it's a bit more complicated. With the military, you don't just need military mana, you also need money, because when you have troops in MEIOU and Taxes, you see this guy? That's a real guy. That's 38,000 real people that come from particular provinces. And if they die in real life. And by real life, I mean in MEIOU and Taxes. So this is an actual person, and they're coming from actual provinces, their actual population, and they matter. And they need food, they need salt, they need fuel, they need consumer goods, they need military goods, industrial goods, and knowledge. That sounds a lot to worry about. Fret not, it isn't. Here's how the system works. Step 1. You, through this button here in the estate screen, can review your national military. Here you can see what goods are being demanded. Don't worry about it. The system handles it for you. And then you can see the size of the feudal levies, the citizen militia, the tribal hosts, and the state army. These three are controlled by estates, the nobility, burghers, and tribes, respectively. This is the state army, your army, right? Now, the state army is enlarged in one of two ways. You'll notice that there are 42,000 people in the state army, and if we were to add a bunch of the feudal levy to that, that would get to this number here that we have, 81,000. If all we were doing was taking men from the state army, this number and this number would be the same. So we have a state army of a certain size, and we have these estate armies, also of certain sizes. The state army you get as manpower. Simple, right? That's your manpower. The estate ones, you would need to levy troops from them to get them as manpower. Okay? Fairly simple. The way that you tax this estates is through the clan host, noble levies, and citizen service taxes. Now, bear in mind that you're doing all this through the delegator. So what's actually going to happen is you're going to say, sorry, wrong one. You're doing all this through the delegator. So what's actually going to happen is you're going to say, hey, spend 19 mil points. And the delegator will go out there and say, does it make sense for me right now to be using these taxes or these taxes? Because these ones, conscription, levies, and volunteers, they're how the game takes and builds the state army. So you can see right now we're spending a bit on levies and a bit on volunteers. Now, to take from the levies, citizen militia, and tribal hosts, all you need is mil points. However, to build the state army using volunteers, levies, and conscription, you need both mil points and money, which is why you want to set a state recruitment budget by going into this pop-up and then clicking this button. In here, you can see that we are currently spending 60% of our national tax income. And I believe when it says tax, it doesn't mean tax. It means this national income number here. We're going to spend 60% of this national income number. And we can see that that lines up, right? 188 is roughly 60%. I think probably exactly 60% of 314 on our army budget. Okay, so we understand that we're spending money and mana. And you can change this, by the way. I find as you get to the late game, if you're not, needing to have your army as big as this would allow it to be, you can substantially reduce this amount of money and then end up with wildly more money left over for yourself. Now that money is going to be spent on two things that you can see in this tooltip: military maintenance and military recruitment. Those are things that happen in every province that you own. maybe only cause, but basically every province that you own. And so if we go into a province and we hover over the military tooltip here, we can see, and I know this is probably quite small on your screen, sorry about that. We can see if we cycle through to the right tab that we are spending 1.1 ducats on training and 0.19 ducats on recruitment. You have a certain amount of money that will be assigned to each of your provinces. It'll spread it out, and it'll try to spread it out in the way that makes it most effective to create the largest sized army. It will spread it out, and then it will spend the money first on training. Training is maintaining the existing size of your army. If it has spent all the money that needs to be spent on training, which will be affected by the size of the army and the price of the goods required to maintain it, then it will go to recruitment, which increases the size. So you can see how by spending X ducats, you will slowly reach an equilibrium where X ducats equals the training expense of the number of men that you have. It will over time trend towards that number, and that can trend up and it can trend down. If you don't spend enough money, or if the price of the goods changes dramatically, for example, then you will find that your national army size will start declining. So you need to keep a little bit of an eye on that. Realistically, it mostly averages out as long as you're trying to get like good market access and you're not causing huge problems. Now, if you're expecting huge problems, let's say you happen to know that you get a ton, and this is fairly advanced, but let's say you know you're getting a ton of your salt from China, for example, and you know you're going to go to war with China and you're going to end up being unable to trade with them. You can go in here and manage war stockpiles. You can stockpile any of the goods that are required by the army. You can designate an amount of funds and it will then use those funds to try and maintain a certain stockpile. So you can go in here and you can say, let's add 100 ducats to the fund. It reckons it's going to be able to stockpile 23 units of this stuff with that much. Okay, I've never used that, so I wouldn't worry about it too much if that seems a little bit over the top. But you can build war stockpiles if you're anticipating market fluctuations not in your favor at a crucial moment. So, I'm just going to refer to my notes so I make sure I get all this right. So, you understand that you build your army here using mill points and money. That builds your national army. Where does the money come from that builds the estates armies? Let me just get those back up here. So the feudal levies, let's focus on the nobility because they're the most feature complete of the estates. The others work very similarly. The feudal levies are having right now spent on them every year 1,041 ducats. That's tons of money to build this big army, a 328,000 man strong army. And that's not being spent by us, crucially. That's being spent by the estates. The estates are spending that money. We're spending the mill points. You can see that we're spending 12.4 mill points. The estates don't have any mill points. We're spending the mill points, but they're spending the money. Getting men from the levy, from the estates, especially the nobles, almost exclusively the nobles unless you're a tribal place, in which case almost exclusively the tribes, is very likely to be how you get your men for the first start of the game. In the mid-game, it's balanced. In the late game, it's all state army. This is the broad arc of history that MEIOU and Taxes takes place within. You are going from an estate decentralized system to a state centralized system. So at the beginning of the game, you're going to have reforms. This is obviously late game, but I looked around and Vijayanagar was one of the ones that had the worst reforms. You're going to start with reforms like this, like extended levies. Now notice that this gives plus 60% noble investment in feudal levies. That will mean that if you're providing enough mill points to put up that part of the bargain, then the amount of money that they're prepared to plow into feudal levies is 60% higher. There are other things that will change this. So for example, high obligations here increases the mana cost for noble levies. And you'll usually, especially if you're starting in Europe, this will be like level 3 or 4 plus 60 or 80% mana cost for noble levies, making it much more expensive for you to basically put in the mana that persuades them to put in the money that both combined results in the army. Many of the things that you do to weaken the nobility will also weaken the feudal levies that you are able to access and make accessing them more expensive. Getting rid of that privilege, notable exception, that'll make it cheaper to get the noble levies. So keep that in mind. You do not want to weaken the nobility, and check what each of the reforms does. You do not want to weaken the nobility before you have put yourself in a position to have a state army. How do you get a state army? It's all about raising this and this mostly. All of these help, basically. So let's talk a little bit about what causes what to cost what. Lots of what's in that sentence. I promise it will make sense. There are 6 taxes that we need to talk about. Let's first talk about the clan host, noble levies, and citizen service levies. Citizen service taxes. These are ways of getting men from the estates, remember. Here are the things that affect the cost. Remember that the delegator will attempt to spend the least for the most at all times. So if you make it cheaper in the whole country to do noble levies, the balancer will spend more on noble levies until it's no longer efficient to do so. The things that affect the cost on noble levies are... Where is it? Here they are. The size of the pop group, which obviously makes sense, right? It costs more to recruit more people. The privileges and reforms that they have. The loyalty of that estate. So if you have really loyal nobles, it will cost you less mill points to build your feudal levies. Very important. It will also cost less to tax if there is lower autonomy. Now that's pretty much universally true. So autonomy has a big impact on the cost of taxes. So for all 3 of those, it's about the size of the people you're trying to raise, because obviously, it wouldn't make sense if it was just randomly way easier to recruit from provinces that had higher populations. The loyalty, autonomy, and privileges. Those are the important things to remember. Then, for volunteers, levies, and conscription, let's talk about the differences between those things. Levies is the slightly confusing one. Levies is basically about getting the people from the clan host, noble levies, and citizen service into the main army. That's how that works. It's kind of pulling the state army together. Don't worry too much about levies. It's the clan host, noble levies, and citizen service costs that you should focus on. Then there's volunteers. Volunteers are building your state army directly, not coming from one of these things, but directly building the state army, not coming from an estate at all. And then there's conscription, which is again building the state army. Conscription is like volunteers, but on steroids. It gets you far more people, but it costs more money. It costs less mana, more money. The things that affect the cost of levies, volunteers, and conscription are the peasant population, non-elite population, the province size, and the autonomy, and the tax efficiency. Tax efficiency doesn't do levies, sorry, but for volunteers and conscription, and then also reforms. So tax efficiency, when it says things like 10 plus 10% times state reach base tax efficiency, then bear in mind that that's not just money tax, that's manpower tax as well. So keep that in mind. That is pretty much all that I think I wanted to mention. Keep in mind that if you're increasing the amount of manpower, right, yes, so the key thing to remember is that your manpower is going to be based on whichever limiting factor limits it first. Is it how much mill points you're spending or how much money you're spending? Early game, it's going to be mana, basically. It's usually mana, but it can be mill points. Early game, you're likely to be spending mill points, mana, on trying to get people, soldiers from the estates. Late game is going to be about using mana and money to get it from the state army. Keep that in mind. So if you increase the amount of money you're spending and your army isn't getting any bigger and you increase it more and the army isn't getting any bigger, it's probably because you haven't got enough mana. And if you increase the mana and the army isn't getting any bigger and you increase it more and the army isn't getting any bigger, then you probably haven't got enough money. So keep them balanced, basically. You might want to slowly reduce. Let's say you're spending as much money as you want to be spending on the army. You could slowly reduce the amount of mill points and see if it makes a difference. Now, bear in mind, you will almost always be bottlenecked by mana, basically. Unless you're flat broke, it's likely you're going to be bottlenecked by mana because you can spend a lot of mana and get a lot of people, which is worth remembering, right? That's useful to know. Next thing to remember, don't piss off the nobles if you're about to go to war, if you're relying on the feudal levies, which is very likely that you are in the early game. Third, and finally, remember that people die, and when people die in real life, they die in the game. When they die in the game, their pops go away. Oh, I combine the army, nose on an elephant. That is a great model. Look at that. Dope. Anyway, when people die, they actually die. These are real people who are born, buy food from your market, work in your factories. If you kill them, are they dead? Don't do that. if you can avoid it. Every time you take an unnecessary attrition tick, your population declines. Population is an incredibly powerful resource in MEIOU and Taxes, and you should be leveraging it to your best advantage. Now, I hope all of that was correct. I'm pretty sure it is. I ran some of it by a M&T dev called Jark, who's very helpful. Much appreciation to her. Thank you for the input, but I'm not blaming her if I got anything wrong. I'm sure it's because I misspoke. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. The next tutorial I'm currently planning on doing is on how taxes work generally. I know I have a I think I have a tutorial on this from a while ago, but I think it's time to do a new one. Some things have changed. If you have any other topics you want me to cover, let me know. Other than that, thanks all very much for watching. I'll see you next time.